What if everything you thought you knew about your past was a lie? Imagine walking into a courtroom, accused of a crime you didn't commit, and the judge staring down at you isn't just some stranger in a black robe. She's your mother. Sounds impossible, right? But for Jamal Carter, this wasn't just some twisted dream. It was his reality, a powerful judge, a forgotten past, and a boy who refuses to be erased. This story will make you question everything: justice, family, truth. Because sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who leave the deepest scars. And tonight, one boy is about to do the unthinkable, make the most feared woman in town face the truth she spent 14 years running from. But here's the real question. Will she finally admit the truth? Or will she walk away again? Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. The night hung over Oak Ridge like a heavy curtain, thick with mist and silence. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but eerie, like the town itself was holding its breath. Harrison Avenue, the street where the richest families lived, was empty except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the flickering of old streetlights that cast jagged shadows on the cracked pavement. It was past midnight when the wailing of sirens broke through the quiet. The flashing red and blue lights painted the darkness as a squad car sped toward the Whitmore estate, a grand Victorian house that stood on the highest hill in town. It was the kind of house people drove past slowly, imagining the lives of those who lived inside, polished, privileged, untouchable. But tonight, its iron gate stood wide open, and inside, just beyond the perfectly trimmed hedges, stood Jamal Carter, hands cuffed behind his back, his skinny frame illuminated by the harsh glow of a flashlight. His face was expressionless, but his deep brown eyes, those eyes, burned with something unreadable. Sheriff Ronald Briggs stepped out of his cruiser, his boots crunching against the gravel. A man who had spent 30 years patrolling the streets of Oak Ridge, and yet nothing about this felt routine. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "A damn break-in at Judge Whitmore's house? This town's gonna lose its mind." His deputy, a young recruit who still jumped at the sound of his own radio, glanced nervously at Jamal. "He didn't put up a fight," the deputy said, "didn't even try to run." Briggs narrowed his eyes. That part didn't sit right. Most kids caught trespassing would either bolt or cry, but this one just stood there, waiting. Briggs stepped forward, his shadow looming over Jamal. "All right, kid. Let's make this simple. What the hell were you doing in Judge Whitmore's house?" Jamal didn't flinch. He barely even blinked. "Looking for something," he said, his voice even. Briggs exhaled sharply, already irritated. "You looking for trouble? Because you just found it." Still, Jamal didn't break. "I wasn't stealing." Briggs crossed his arms. "Then what were you doing?" The boy's jaw tightened. His fingers twitched against the cold steel of the cuffs. He glanced at the house behind him, its massive windows like dark, hollow eyes staring back at him. "Trying to find the truth." Briggs scoffed. "What truth, kid?" And that's when Jamal looked up, his expression unreadable but his words clear. "The truth about my mother." The weight of his words settled in the air between them. The young deputy shifted uncomfortably, but Briggs wasn't a man easily rattled. "And what the hell does Judge Whitmore's house have to do with that?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Because the woman who lives there, she's my mother." Silence, a beat too long. And then Briggs let out a sharp laugh, the kind that was more disbelief than amusement. "Kid, you're telling me that Judge Eleanor Whitmore, one of the most powerful women in this damn town, a woman who has never had kids, is your mother?" Jamal held his gaze. "Yes." Briggs studied him for a long moment. The kid wasn't joking. There wasn't a single trace of uncertainty in his voice, and that was unsettling. But facts were facts. Judge Whitmore had no children. Everyone in Oak Ridge knew that. And yet, this boy, this black boy. Briggs exhaled and turned toward his deputy. "Get him in the car. He's spending the night in lockup." As the deputy led Jamal toward the cruiser, Detective Lisa Henderson pulled up, stepping out of her car in a rush. She was young, sharp-eyed, too stubborn for her own good. She was only assigned to public defense cases, the ones no one cared about, but something about this case already felt different. She reached the sheriff just as the doors slammed shut behind Jamal. "What's the charge?" she asked, her breath visible in the cold air. Briggs sighed. "Trespassing, possibly burglary." Lisa frowned. "Was anything stolen?" Briggs hesitated. Nothing was missing. The house had no signs of forced entry. The kid hadn't even tried to run. "Not that we know of," he admitted. Lisa's eyes narrowed. "Then why the cuffs?" Briggs turned toward the squad car, where Jamal sat in the back seat, silent, unshaken. "Because that kid just told me Judge Whitmore is his mother." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the boy again. He stared straight ahead, not at them, not at the house, but at something far beyond. The silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them could name. And in that moment, Lisa knew. This wasn't just a case. This was something else, something bigger. Something that was about to unravel everything they thought they knew about this town, about Eleanor Whitmore, and about the boy who refused to be ignored. The air inside the Oak Ridge courthouse was thick, heavy with whispers and the quiet scratching of pens against notepads. The room was packed. Reporters, town officials, and curious onlookers filled every seat, their eyes locked onto the center of the room, where Jamal Carter sat, his wrists free but his future uncertain. He wasn't afraid, not of the judge staring down at him, not of the murmurs circling around like vultures waiting for something, anything, to explode, and especially not of the truth. At the very top of the courtroom, seated in a high-backed chair of polished mahogany, was Judge Eleanor Whitmore. She was poised, elegant and sharp, her blonde hair pulled into a severe bun, her deep green eyes piercing and unreadable. The room respected her, feared her. She was the woman who had sent murderers to prison with a single stroke of her pen, the woman whose name alone could turn criminals into ghosts. And yet, the boy sitting before her, in an oversized button-down that barely fit his small frame, was the first to ever shake her composure. Lisa Henderson, his attorney, sat beside him. She was young, relentless, and too damn stubborn to let this case go without a fight. "Your Honor," Lisa began, standing with measured confidence, "we request that all charges against my client be dismissed immediately. There is no evidence of theft, no sign of forced entry. My client was inside the Whitmore estate, but he was not there to steal. He was searching for something, someone." She turned toward Jamal, her voice steady. "Would you like to tell the court why you were there?" Jamal stood, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He lifted his chin, and then he looked straight at Judge Whitmore. The entire courtroom fell into complete silence. His voice didn't shake. "I was looking for my mother." A few muffled gasps echoed through the benches, but Jamal didn't react. He held her gaze, watching, waiting, searching for the crack in her perfect, untouchable armor. But Eleanor Whitmore didn't move, didn't flinch. "And who exactly do you claim is your mother?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Jamal inhaled deeply. "You." The word dropped like a bomb. Gasps erupted across the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to write, cameras clicked, and the whispers turned into a low, electrified buzz. Eleanor's fingers twitched against the gavel, but her face remained unreadable. "That is an absurd claim," she said, her voice tight, controlled. Jamal didn't blink. "Is it?" For the first time since she entered the courtroom, something flickered in Eleanor's expression, a hesitation, a shadow of something unspoken. Briggs, standing near the back, muttered under his breath, "What the hell is this kid playing at?" Lisa stepped forward. "Your Honor, my client's claim is not without merit. He has reason to believe that he is, in fact, your biological son." Eleanor let out a breath, slow and measured, before folding her hands on the desk in front of her. "This is ridiculous." Lisa didn't back down. "Then deny it. Swear under oath that you have never had a child." The challenge hung in the air, a dare, a demand. The courtroom waited. Eleanor hesitated. It was less than a second, half a breath, a flicker, but it was enough for Jamal to see it, enough for Lisa to catch it, and enough to set the entire courtroom on fire. "No further questions, Your Honor," Lisa said, stepping back. Eleanor's fingers gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning white. "This case is about trespassing, not personal fantasies. I will not entertain these baseless accusations in my courtroom." Lisa didn't argue. She didn't need to. The damage was already done. The judge had hesitated. The whispers were already growing louder. Jamal sat down, his heart pounding, his breath steady. He didn't need proof yet. He had time. And now, so did the whole town. Because whether Judge Whitmore liked it or not, the impossible truth was out in the storm that had started in the courtroom didn't die down when the gavel struck. It followed Judge Eleanor Whitmore like a shadow. The murmurs, the stares, the weight of a single second, her hesitation, had cracked something that could never be sealed again. Inside her office, the walls of polished mahogany and neatly stacked case files felt suffocating. She poured herself a glass of whiskey, the ice clinking against the crystal, but the burn in her throat did nothing to drown out the echoes. In her mind, "You are my mother." Jamal Carter's voice wouldn't leave her. His face, those eyes, they haunted her. She slammed the glass down on the desk, her hands shaking. No, she had erased that part of her life, hadn't she? A knock at the door made her snap back to the present. It was Lisa Henderson, the young defense attorney who had turned a simple trespassing case into a courtroom scandal. Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You have 5 minutes, Miss Henderson." Lisa didn't waste time. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, her eyes scanning the judge's rigid posture. "You hesitated," Lisa said. Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Lisa folded her arms, stepping closer. "Back in court, when I asked if you ever had a child." Eleanor met her gaze, cold and unwavering. "I hesitated because I was insulted by the absurdity of your question." Lisa let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Right. And yet everyone in that courtroom saw it. A woman like you doesn't hesitate unless there's something to hide." Eleanor stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "You don't know me, Miss Henderson." Lisa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But I know when someone's lying." Eleanor's expression darkened, but before she could speak, Lisa placed a manila folder on the desk. "I did some digging," Lisa said. Eleanor didn't touch it, didn't even look at it. Lisa opened the folder anyway. Inside was an old missing persons report. A baby boy, reported missing 14 years ago. Eleanor's heart stopped. Lisa tapped the paper with her finger. The report was filed under the name Sarah Whitmore, your maiden name. Eleanor felt her stomach drop. A mistake, a thread she had forgotten to cut. Lisa studied her, waiting. "Tell me I'm wrong," Lisa said softly. Eleanor clenched her fists. "Get out of my office." Lisa didn't move. "Jamal deserves the truth." Eleanor's voice was ice. "The truth," she hissed, "is that this conversation is over." Lisa exhaled, but she didn't push further. She simply closed the folder and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back once more. "He looks like you know." And then she was gone. Eleanor stood there staring at the desk, at the whiskey glass, at the past that refused to stay buried. That night she didn't go home. She went somewhere she hadn't dared to return to in 14 years. The road outside St. Mary's Shelter for Women and Children was cracked and forgotten, much like the people who once sought refuge there. The building had been shut down for years, its doors locked, its windows boarded up. But Eleanor remembered this place. She remembered it too well. She pushed open the rusted gate, her heels crunching against the overgrown gravel path. Every step was a ghost. She reached the door, running her fingers over the old, chipped wood. And then, hesitantly, she reached into her purse and pulled out a key. It had been 14 years, but she had never thrown it away. The door creaked as she stepped inside. Dust floated in the moonlight, settling over the abandoned chairs and empty beds. She moved through the halls, past the broken cribs, past the peeling paint, past the memories she had sworn never to revisit. Then she stopped in front of room 14. Her hands trembled as she turned the knob. Inside, the room was exactly as she remembered. A small bed, a wooden rocking chair, a single framed picture nailed to the wall, a cheap painting of a sunflower. She had picked that painting for him. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, she let herself remember. Remember the baby in her arms. Remember the night she left. Remember the mistake that had finally come back to claim her. The past is a living thing. It breathes beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to claw its way back. Eleanor Whitmore had spent 14 years burying it, locking it behind doors she swore never to open. But here she was, standing in the abandoned St. Mary's Shelter for Women and Children, where the air smelled of dust and forgotten promises. Her heels made no sound on the old wooden floor as she stepped into room 14, her fingers trailing over the faded wallpaper, the peeling, edges curling like old wounds. The rocking chair in the corner was still there, the cheap sunflower painting still hung on the wall, and yet everything felt smaller than she remembered. Or maybe she was just bigger. She swallowed hard and forced herself to sit in that same rocking chair, the one where she had once held him. Her hands trembled as she traced the armrest, as if she could still feel the warmth of tiny fingers clutching her wrist. She could still hear it, his cry. The first time she ever heard his voice, raw and hungry and demanding. She had been so young, too young, a scared college girl who had made a choice that no one, not her parents, not her professors, not even herself, was ready for. And so, one night, in the cold silence of this very room, she had made another choice, one she had spent every single day since then pretending never happened. A sudden noise jolted her back to the present, a door creaking, footsteps on the floorboards. Her breath caught. As she turned sharply, her pulse racing. "Jamal!" He stood in the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the dim moonlight streaming through a broken window. His presence was so quiet, so steady, that for a second she thought she was hallucinating. Like a ghost from the past had stepped through time itself. She inhaled sharply, standing so fast the chair nearly tipped over. "How did you get here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. Jamal didn't move, didn't flinch. He just watched her, studied her, and then, after a long, unbearable silence, "I followed you." Her stomach twisted. "Why?" Jamal took a step forward, the floor creaking beneath him. His voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it, something Eleanor wasn't ready to face. "Because I knew you'd come here." Her throat tightened. "You shouldn't be here, Jamal." He let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Neither should you." Silence settled between them, thick and unbreakable. And then, in the dim glow of the room, Jamal's gaze softened. This was my room, wasn't it? Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. I don't know what you think you know, but you left me here. The words landed like a punch. Eleanor's breath caught. Jamal took another step, his voice quiet but sharp. I remember things. Not everything, not faces. But I remember this place. His eyes scanned the room like he was seeing ghosts in the walls. I remember lying in that crib. I remember the sound of this chair moving at night. I remember a voice singing. His eyes locked onto hers, and something inside her shattered. Was it you? She couldn't breathe. The walls of room 14 seemed to close in around her, the weight of 14 years pressing down like a tidal wave. She could lie. She had lied before, but not now, not to him. Eleanor exhaled shakily and finally, let the words fall from her lips. Yes. Jamal blinked. For the first time since the courtroom, his breath hitched, like he hadn't expected her to actually admit it. His hands curled at his sides. Then why? Her heart clenched. Jamal took another step forward, and suddenly he was so close. Not the boy in the courtroom, not the case everyone whispered about, just him. Why did you leave me? Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought of the night she ran, the way she had pressed a final kiss to his tiny forehead, her tears soaking into his blanket. The way she had turned away before she could change her mind, the way she had walked out the door and never looked back, until now. When she finally opened her eyes, she saw it, the pain she had passed down, the wound she had left in her wake. And for the first time in 14 years, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman who never lost control, who never cracked, who never looked back, broke. The courthouse hallways were eerily quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a cold mist. It wasn't the usual kind of quiet, the professional hum of lawyers whispering and clerks shuffling papers. No, this was something else, something heavier, something waiting to explode. Jamal Carter stood in front of the heavy double doors leading back into the courtroom. His pulse was steady, but his hands trembled at his sides. He clenched them into fists. Lisa Henderson stood beside him, her expression unreadable. She had spent the last week tearing through documents, making calls, digging through the secrets of Eleanor Whitmore. And now, everything was about to be laid bare. Lisa turned to him. Are you ready? Jamal exhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the doors. I don't know. Lisa didn't push. She knew this wasn't just about winning a case. This was about truth, about finally dragging what had been buried for 14 years into the light, about facing the woman on the other side of that door. The bailiff called out, voice firm, "All rise for Judge Eleanor Whitmore." The doors swung open, and there she was, seated at the bench, dressed in her usual black robe, hair pulled back, expression unreadable. Unshaken. At least that's what she wanted people to see. But Jamal saw something else. The tightness in her jaw, the way her fingers gripped the gavel just a little too hard. She was unraveling, and she knew it. Lisa took her place, beside Jamal, clearing her throat before speaking. Your Honor, my client has the right to be heard. He has the right to demand answers. And more importantly, he has the right to demand justice. Eleanor's voice was smooth, cold. Justice for what exactly? Lisa stepped forward, her presence unwavering. For the truth you stole from him. For the years you let him believe he was nothing. For the life you abandoned when you walked away. Eleanor didn't move, didn't blink, but Jamal saw it again. The hesitation, the crack in her armor. Lisa continued, her voice unwavering. We have proof. A missing persons report filed under your maiden name. Medical records linking you to a pregnancy 14 years ago. Financial records showing anonymous donations made to St. Mary's Shelter, the same place where Jamal was left behind. She placed the documents on the bench one by one, like laying down cards in a game that Eleanor had already lost. You can't deny it anymore. Judge Whitmore. The room was so quiet that Jamal could hear his own heartbeat. Eleanor slowly reached for the papers, her hands steady, too steady. She flipped through them, absorbing the evidence that she had spent years pretending didn't exist. And then, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, she looked at him. Really looked at him. Jamal's heart clenched, because for a moment, he hoped that she would say something, that she would finally break the silence, that she would finally see him, but instead she set the papers down and exhaled. This court is adjourned. She banged the gavel. Jamal's stomach dropped. Lisa's eyes widened. That's it! Jamal's voice broke through the tense air. Eleanor stood, removing her robe, her face carefully blank. There's nothing left to say. Jamal shot up from his chair. Nothing left to say? His voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp, raw. She turned to leave. He moved before he could. Stop himself. You're just gonna walk away. Again. That made her stop. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Jamal's hands shook at his sides, his voice lower now, but filled with something else. You left me once, and now you're doing it again. Eleanor's back remained turned. Jamal swallowed hard. You abandoned me. Do you have any idea what that did to me? She didn't answer, didn't move, and something inside him cracked. I waited for you. His voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. Every day, I waited. I thought maybe you'd come back. Maybe you made a mistake. Maybe you loved me. The words hung between them. Something in Eleanor's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. She didn't say anything. Jamal let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Guess I was wrong. And then, finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost broken. You weren't wrong. Jamal's breath caught. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. You were never wrong. And then, without another word, she walked away. It had been a week since the courtroom doors slammed shut. A week since Judge Eleanor Whitmore turned her back and walked away. Jamal Carter had spent those 7 days feeling like a ghost in his own life. People stared at him differently now, some with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with something uglier. They whispered about him in the grocery store. Teachers at school looked at him a second too long before pretending they weren't watching. And every morning, his foster mother, Miss Lorraine, tried to ask if he was okay. He always answered the same way. I'm fine. But he wasn't. Because how do you move on from something like this? From standing in front of the woman who gave birth to you, from watching her hesitate, from watching her choose silence over you again? Jamal had spent his whole life wondering who she was. Now he knew, and somehow that made it worse. That night, as rain tapped against the window of his small bedroom, he made a decision. He wasn't going to wait anymore. The Whitmore estate was exactly the way it had been the night he first stepped foot on its grounds. Cold, untouched. Jamal stood at the gates, gripping the iron bars so tight his fingers ached. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe she wouldn't be home. Maybe she'd slam the door in his face. Maybe this was stupid. But he had come anyway, because he needed this. With a deep breath, he stepped forward and knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, harder this time. Still, silence. Jamal exhaled, his jaw clenching. Fine. He turned to leave, shaking his head at his own foolishness. Then, The door opened, and there she was, Eleanor Whitmore, standing in the doorway barefoot, wearing a simple black sweater instead of her usual sharp courtroom attire. Her hair was loose around her shoulders. She looked human. For the first time, she didn't seem like a judge. She seemed like a woman who hadn't slept in 7 days. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Jamal swallowed, his heart pounding. I just needed to say one last thing. Eleanor gripped the edge of the doorframe. Go ahead. Jamal hesitated. Then slowly he forced the words out. You don't get to do this to me. Her brows pulled together. Jamal, no. His voice was firm. You don't get to just walk away like that. Not after everything. Eleanor's breath hitched. Jamal's throat tightened. You don't have to be my mother. You don't have to love me, but you don't get to pretend I don't exist, not anymore. She exhaled, her fingers tightening against the doorframe. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Eleanor moved. She stepped forward, past the threshold of her house, until she was standing right in front of him. For the first time, they were eye to eye. And then, she did something he never expected. She dropped to her knees, not because she was weak, not because she was broken, but because she couldn't run anymore. Her hands trembled as she reached for his. Jamal didn't move, didn't pull away, didn't breathe. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she finally said the words he had been waiting to hear his entire life. I'm sorry. A single tear slipped down her face. Jamal's chest ached. You left me. His voice cracked. Eleanor nodded, her throat working around a painful swallow. I did. More silence. The rain started to fall harder. And then, Eleanor spoke. Again, her voice raw. I don't know how to fix this. Jamal's breath shuddered. Neither do I. She exhaled, her grip on his hands tightening. But if you let me, her voice cracked. I want to try. Jamal stared at her. For so long he had dreamed of hearing those words. Now that they were here, now that she was here, he realized something. It wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't change what had been lost. But maybe, just maybe, it was a start. What would you do if your entire life had been built on a lie? If the person who abandoned you suddenly had to face you? Would you demand justice, or would you seek forgiveness? Jamal's story isn't just about the truth. It's about the power of facing your past, no matter how painful it is. And now I want to ask you, what's something from your past that still haunts you? Are you running from it, or are you ready to confront it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story like this. Because trust me, what's coming next, you won't want to miss.